started as this underdog force, this ragtag militia fighting in flip-flops. And, by 2021, 2022, they are essentially the dominant power in Yemen. And they're feeling quite confident. They're essentially feeling like they won the war.
So how do we get from this unlikely victory that the Houthis have over major powers, Saudi Arabia, the United States, to a campaign of bombing and attacks in the Red Sea that would seem to endanger all that the Houthis gained in that prolonged war?
So you have to really remember that since they were founded, the Houthis have been a resistance movement. They've been rebels. That's been their entire identity. And so a rebel force doesn't really naturally then lend itself to becoming a government. They are now the powers that be in Yemen. There's nothing left for them to resist. So they're in this very uncomfortable position in a lot of ways as 2023 rolls around, and people are looking at them to provide basic services. They're looking at them to provide electricity and water. They're looking at them to pay salaries for civil servants who in many cases have gone unpaid for years. And that's quite a lot of pressure on the Houthis.
And no doubt to rebuild the entire country.
And they also do need to rebuild the entire country, which is really in ruins. And all of that is quite expensive. And it's not really clear how they're going to navigate their way out of that.
Right.
This is sort of the context that October 7th rolls around in. The Houthis are in this difficult position. They're facing this kind of prospect of transitioning into a peacetime government, which is going to be very challenging. And in that context, October 7th comes out of nowhere, and suddenly there's potentially an answer to a lot of their problems.
Well, just explain that. How does Hamas attacking Israel, and Israel obviously preparing a ferocious response, how does that potentially solve all of the Houthi problems you just outlined?
Well, it puts the Houthis at the center of this moment in the region where there's just anger all across the Arab world, and the Houthis really insert themselves into that. And they take it up as an opportunity to really live out their narrative, to finally directly enter a war with Israel, which is their declared great enemy.
Right.
So once the Houthis directly enter this conflict, they're shooting missiles at Israel, they're attacking ships in the Red Sea, their popularity at home skyrockets. They find themselves in a situation where they can use this to recruit more fighters. There are enormous rallies that they're holding in the streets of Sana'a of people coming out in solidarity with the Palestinians, protesting against the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. There are just these huge crowds of people holding up their slogan, holding up images of the Houthi leader, and it's really quite a galvanizing moment for them.
So ultimately, this, you're saying, is what the Houthis really want. This is that complicated set of motivations behind their decision to start hurling missiles into the Red Sea. The Houthis may say that what they're doing is just about defending the Palestinians and trying to end Israel's war in Gaza, but it is multi-pronged. And what the Houthis really want is a simpler way to win the hearts and minds of their own people than being the government of Yemen.
Right. I mean, the Houthis have pushed back against that narrative a lot. They're arguing that they're not doing this for popularity, that it's not about domestic reasons, and they say this is a true moral crusade. We're fighting for justice. But the reality is that on the ground, they have benefited a lot in a lot of different ways. So it almost doesn't matter to what extent they believe the ideology that they're espousing. On the ground, there has been a massive benefit to them.
And all of that means that the Houthis would seem to have virtually no motivation to stop doing what they're doing, battling the West in the Red Sea.
Not at all. There's really no reason for them to pull back, and they're very comfortable fighting, and that's what they're doing right now. As soon as it stops, it essentially leaves the Houthis back in a challenging position where they're going to have to figure out how to govern. They're going to have to figure out how to be in power and not how to be the rebels. For the Houthis, it is going to be much easier to keep fighting than it would be for them to govern a country that has been destroyed by decades of war.
We'll be right back.
If you find yourself bewildered by this moment, where there's so much reason for despair and so much reason to hope all at the same time, let me say I hear you. I'm Ezra Klein from New York Times Opinion, host of The Ezra Klein Show. And for me, the best way to beat back that bewildered feeling is to talk it out with the people who have ideas and frameworks for making sense of it. There's going to be plenty to talk about. You can find The Ezra Klein Show wherever you get your podcasts.
Vivian, as the Houthis wage these ongoing attacks, it clearly puts the U.S. in a really complicated spot based on everything you just said, because at some point the U.S. has to respond to these attacks on ships, including U.S.-owned ships and U.S. military ships, but the U.S. has to understand that any retaliation risks playing directly into the complicated motivations you just described. So how does the U.S. try to navigate that?
Right. So for the first few weeks of these attacks, the U.S. does really appear to be trying to avoid entering into this conflict directly. There does seem to be some degree of recognition that there's a real risk of escalation if they get involved, and that the Houthis essentially could be legitimized by, them attacking the Houthis, right? It's finally recognizing the Houthis as worthy of attack. So there's some resistance in the beginning toward that. There does seem to be a consensus at some point within the U.S. establishment that they do need to do something. And they eventually make this sort of statement with the UK and with this coalition, essentially threatening that if the attacks don't stop, they're going to respond. And that statement does seem to sort of lock them into action at that point, because the Houthis have been very clear that they're not going to stop, that they absolutely have no intention of stopping. And in fact, they've declared at this point that they would prefer a direct war with the United States.
So once the U.S. does decide to retaliate, and it does so in a very forceful way, hitting dozens of targets inside Yemen that are controlled by the Houthis, how does the U.S. frame it?
Well, the U.S. is very careful to try to frame this as having nothing to do with Israel and the war in Gaza. They're very concerned that essentially the Houthis are going to be able to weaponize this just to sort of deepen their narrative even more. And so they try to sort of frame it as a coalition response to protect economic interests, to protect global shipping, and really try to emphasize the effect that the Houthi attacks have had on shipping and trade, particularly because they're passing through this incredibly important part of the Red Sea that leads to the Suez Canal.
So when the U.S. responds, what President Biden is saying is, I'm not going to give you the propaganda tool of saying that this conflict is about what you, the Houthis, say it's about, which is Israel and Hamas and Gaza. We are going to kind of strip all of this of that language and that symbols.
Yes, that is what they say. That doesn't go over very well in the region or in Yemen. I mean, we pretty immediately were speaking to Yemenis who were saying, even in territories that are hostile towards the Houthis, were saying that, it looks like the U.S. just wants to attack them because they're defending the Palestinians.
So immediately, that U.S. effort to kind of parse this and frame it is seen as futile throughout Yemen.
Yeah, it definitely falls flat in Yemen and in the broader Middle East. And there is honestly such a high level of anti-Americanism across the region right now that it's very easy for the Houthis to spread this narrative and to gain popularity over it.
Regardless of how these attacks are being discussed, framed, do the U.S. coalition airstrikes work at all? Are they doing what the United States wants them to do, which is to weaken the Houthis' capacity to strike ships in the Red Sea, or in any way deter the Houthis from continuing to wage these attacks?
They certainly do not deter the Houthis, who pretty immediately have started to stage attacks again and have vowed that they're going to be staging even bigger attacks. And they've said now that they see not only targets tied to Israel as legitimate targets, but any targets tied to American or British interests as legitimate targets for them to hit. So essentially they are now widening the war. They're saying that this is a world war that we are excited to enter into now, and we're ready for it.
Excited to enter. That's how they're framing this.
Yeah, they are really, honestly, pretty open delight. I mean, there was a post today on social media from one of their politicians basically saying, and I'll quote him, "We're not worried about this battle, nor do we care about it. The missiles and planes that we were bombed with during the past 9 years are the same ones that America has today.
So instead of doing anything to contain the Houthis' aggression, the U.S. response, as perhaps many feared, risks, if not already is, expanding the threat of the Houthis. And any future attacks from the U.S., which the U.S. claims it will undertake, is going to do the same. Just going to make things worse.
Right, there does seem to be a real risk of further escalation at this moment. It's not clear how this is going to quiet down.
But what are the options for the U.S. if armed conflict and retaliation is proving to be so ineffective? What is basically the way out of a dynamic in which responses from the U.S. and its allies are feeding the Houthi narrative and making the Houthis more popular at home and less likely to ever want to stop doing this?
The U.S. definitely doesn't have a great option or menu of responses in terms of how it's going to address the Houthi threat. However, one argument that we're hearing pretty consistently from regional American allies like Qatar and Oman, which is a neighbor of Yemen and knows Yemen very well, has been that the only way to address the threat posed by the Houthis is to resolve the underlying conflict that is inflaming tensions across the region. And that, they say, is the war in Gaza. And their argument essentially is that it is the war in Gaza that is spreading all of these tensions, that is causing all of these different forms of escalation, and that is giving the Houthis a pretext for their attacks. And if you can resolve that underlying conflict, you can reach a ceasefire, and you can diffuse that, then you will ultimately diffuse all of the other problems that are going on in the region right now.
My guess is that the U.S. rejects that logic because it might feel to them like a reward for what the Houthis are up to. You know, we're going to call for a ceasefire, we're going to push for an end to Israel's battle against Hamas just to stop the Houthis from attacking ships in the Red Sea.
Right. I mean, there's certainly a fear now in the region and beyond that the Houthis know that they have this power and that they're not going to simply stop using it, right? They know now that they can essentially, hold global trade hostage by attacking ships in the Red Sea, and it's difficult to imagine them never using that card again if they know that they can play it.
Right. And how should we think about that, Vivian? I mean, the reality that in a very short time, the Houthis go from the clan that they were to essentially the governing power in Yemen to now a force that is not just willing but able to menace all of Western commerce in the Red Sea.
I mean, it's really a remarkable rise. I mean, the Houthis were such an underdog, and I don't think any of us imagined that we would be in this position when somebody sitting in New York even knows who they are, right? They have just risen so quickly, and they've defeated so many enemies that were so much more powerful than them, that they essentially see themselves as finally, in the divine right path now. They see God is on their side. They have no fear, partly because of that. I mean, the Houthis have been very upfront that they are absolutely not afraid of getting dragged into a long and extended war with the United States. And they've explicitly brought up, the precedents of Afghanistan and Vietnam and threatened that, come on, come and enter Yemen, invade Yemen, we're ready for you, and you have no idea what is in for you, essentially. They're this guerrilla fighting force that has managed to withstand much more powerful entities for years and years, and that has put them in this position where they really feel that they have nothing to lose.
Well, Vivian, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
On Wednesday, the United States said that it would designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization in its latest and so far fruitless attempt to pressure the group into ending its attacks in the Red Sea. The Biden administration had removed the Houthis from the U.S. terror list in 2021, saying the decision would make it easier for humanitarian aid to reach the people of Yemen. The latest designation would, among other things, block the Houthis' access to the global financial system and further isolate the group from Western institutions. We'll be right back. Here's what else you need to know today. On Wednesday, the judge overseeing the trial in which the writer E. Jean Carroll has accused Donald Trump of defaming her warned Trump that he could be thrown out of the court if he continues making comments that the jury can hear. The warning came after a lawyer for Carol complained that Trump had been overheard calling the trial a, quote, witch hunt and a con job. And the next two Republican presidential debates, scheduled for Thursday and Sunday night in New Hampshire, have been canceled because just one qualified candidate, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, has agreed to appear. Trump has refused to participate in any primary debates, and a few days ago, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley said that she would refuse to attend unless Trump did, leaving DeSantis as the only candidate willing to debate. Today's episode was produced by Asta Chaturvedi, Aaron Krupke, and Ricky Novetsky. It was edited by MJ Davis-Lynn, contains original music by Alicia Moitu, Mary Lozano, Pat Acosta, and Romy Misto, and was engineered by Chris Wood. Our theme music is by Jim Grunberg and Ben Mansford of Wonderful. That's it for the day. I'm Michael Malone. See you tomorrow.
Indigenous leaders are having a moment.
I think the world is starting to recognize they need us more than we need them.
One leading voice on the power of Indigenous communities to solve the urgent problems of today.
Our ancestors had foretold of a day of reckoning, and it would be Indigenous voices that would restore the soul of our country, and we're seeing that right now.
Plus, a reality check on the World Economic Forum and why it matters. I'm Nyla Voodoo, and from Axios, this is One Big Thing. Greetings from Davos, Switzerland, a town known primarily for hosting the annual World Economic Forum, a gathering of global leaders, CEOs, economists, and more. It may conjure images of the world's elite frolicking in a snowy alpine village, in other words, a little removed from reality. But as I've learned here already, there's also a lot more going on beneath the surface, and there are surprising and powerful voices everywhere you turn.
We have within our DNA multi-generations of strength, of knowledge, of wisdom.
That's Fawn Sharp, Vice President of the Quinault Indian Nation and former President of the National Congress of American Indians. She's also Indigenous co-chair for the World Economic Forum.
By just showing up and bringing that knowledge and strength to the table, it's not just for us, but it's for the rest of the world that's looking for hope, that is in desperate need for solutions. And I think our stories are very inspirational.
Every day, it seems like we're seeing more coverage of Indigenous leaders helming efforts to tackle the world's problems.
It's my life, oh so right.
I hope at the local level that there is accountability for the individuals who are at fault. I hope the DA pushes forward for criminal prosecutions, but I also hope that this serves as a reminder to other communities and law enforcement agencies that this can happen to them and that they should prepare. And even more than that, I hope that Americans wake up and realize that we don't have to live this way and that we should be taking a more proactive response.
Many of the details of the faulty police response described by Attorney General Garland as a failure, they've already been made public. So I'm curious for you personally, how does it feel now that after all this time these details are accounted for in a federal report?
It's hard to read, but I mean it's necessary, and everybody needs to be looking at this report, reading it in detail, and following recommendations.
I want to ask you, it's been some months since we last spoke. This day has to be excruciating. How are you and your family doing?
Just supporting each other. You know, the kids, they were at school, and it's business as usual. I tell my older ones not to read the news when I know something's coming out to protect them. You know, you have to go and hear all of this information and do, you know, media And then my kids get home from school and we're going to rush to Bandera to go see my daughter play basketball, and I have to be present for them.
Yeah. When you and I last spoke, you were running for mayor of Uvalde, and when we talked, you told me then that people in your community that you were talking to as you were knocking on doors, they wanted to move forward. And you also told me that you felt that people needed to heal. Today, do you think that this accounting of what happened at Robb Elementary School, do you think having this all laid out in this manner helps Uvalde move forward to the kind of healing that you talked about?
I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it is some answers that we've had questions to, but ultimately the steps afterward and what our local officials do with this information is going to dictate where we go from here.
Kimberly Mata Rubio, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
Coming up on WVXU, Congress has moved to avert a partial government shutdown. The temporary spending bill is intended to buy lawmakers time so they can continue their efforts toward fully funding the government. More on the story coming up at 5:35 during All Things Considered on 91.7 WVXU.
WVXU goes wherever you do. Listen to 91.7 online at iHeartRadio.com and on your mobile device through the iHeartRadio app.
Support comes from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine and UC Physicians, where physician educators have a mission to train the next generation of compassionate primary care physicians so they can be there for their patients for life. You can learn more at med.uc.edu/indispensable.
Local music lovers, Radio Artifact is Cincinnati's home for local music and is now available through your Amazon Echo. Enable the Radio Artifact skill and ask Alexa to open Radio Artifact, or to take the music with you anywhere you go, listen with WVXU's free mobile app. Pretty easy, right?
This traffic report is supported by Unbound.org. Northbound 75 at Mitchell, there's a wreck on the left shoulder. Westbound 275, the ramp to Blue Rock Road, there's a wreck on the left side of the ramp. And Branch Hill Guinea Pike still closed both north and southbound between Paxton and Guinea Road and Loveland Miamiville because of crash investigation. From 9 first warning weather, light snow likely tonight, 22 for the overnight low. Spotty light snow continues Friday with 1 to 3 inches total expected. A high tomorrow of 24 with some flurries tomorrow night. It's 33 degrees now. Thank you for tuning in today to 91.7 WVXU.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Workday. With AI at the core of its system, Workday is committed to delivering continuous innovation to help teams stay agile. Workday, the finance and HR system for a changing world. From Procter & Gamble, maker of Align Probiotic, a daily supplement designed by gastroenterologists to help relieve occasional bloating, gas, and abdominal discomfort. More at alignprobiotics.com. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Juana Summers.
And I'm Ari Shapiro. A mother and her 2 children drowned over the weekend trying to cross the Rio Grande River from Mexico into Texas. Their deaths underscore the painful human cost of the political conflict at the border. Stefania Corpi of Texas Public Radio has been learning more about the family. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Ari. Thanks for having me.
What can you tell us about the mother and her 2 young children who drowned?
Well, according to local shelters, Terma de la Sancha arrived in Piedras Negras on Friday night with her children, 10-year-old Jorley Ruby and Jonathan Agustin, who was 8 years old. They immediately tried to cross the Rio Grande to Eagle Pass on a dangerous and a very cold night. They ended up drowning. Her sister Monica and son Victor survived. The survivors were rescued by Grupo Beta, the humanitarian branch of the Mexican National Migration Institute.
Have you been able to learn where they began their journey and where they were headed?
Well, we've learned that they have family in North Carolina, and they were likely trying to head that way when they arrived at Piedras Negras from the state of Mexico, which is around 800 miles from the border. It's not clear how they traveled there. The La Sancha sister, Monica, told local media here they were traveling with their children to escape the violence they face in their hometown, which has one of the highest rates of femicides and is largely under the control of drug cartels, like the Familia Michoacana.
We've been hearing for the past few years about more people arriving at the border from Central America and Venezuela and fewer from Mexico. Is that now changing?
Violence in Mexico has been displacing more and more people. I spoke with Madre Isabel Turcios. She's from Frontera Digna, the only shelter available across the Eagle Pass border on the Mexican side. She told me they have no record of the La Sancha Cerros family staying with them. She says the family didn't come through here. When people come here, then we have a chance to warn them how dangerous the river is. Madre Isabel wishes she had the chance to warn them how policies change and how the river works. The currents can be very fast and very dangerous.
You mentioned policies changing. The Biden administration has taken action to try to stop Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Texas officials from blocking federal border agents' access to the Riverside Park in Eagle Pass, very near where this family drowned. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. These drownings occurred a couple of days after Texas took control of the park. The state has barred Border Patrol agents from the area. Yesterday, the Biden administration said Texas had until the end of the day to let their agents in. Texas did not change its policy and continues to say it has the authority here given what it calls the White House's failures to control the border. Now, the Justice Department says now this family had already drowned when Texas National Guardsmen refused to give Border Patrol agents access to the river. The Justice Department has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to order Texas to allow Border Patrol agents back into Shelby Park. And the White House has filed several other lawsuits challenging Texas policy on the border. Latest news are Texas authorities arrested several migrants at the park last night and charged them with criminal trespassing. These are the first arrests of migrants since Texas took control of the area.
That is Texas Public Radio's Stefania Corpi speaking with us from Mexico City. Thank you for your reporting.
Thank you.
Vice President Kamala Harris has been taking the lead at the White House when it comes to overseeing efforts to combat gun violence. And the topic is touching the re-election campaign too, as Harris tries to court younger voters who right now aren't showing a lot of enthusiasm about voting for President Biden. NPR White House correspondent Deepa Shivaram has more.
Vice President Harris has been on the road talking to all kinds of community leaders about gun violence. Today she was in a hotel ballroom in downtown Washington with hundreds of mayors. She said she's been dealing with this issue since her time as a prosecutor.
I know what guns do and gun violence does to the human body. For so many of you, you too know what gun violence does to people, to a community, to families, to the psyche of a community.
Last fall, when President Biden created the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, he tapped Harris to take charge. It's an issue that has taken her around the country to meet with advocates and survivors, too. Like at this event last week at a middle school in North Carolina.
When I was speaking with these young leaders before I walked in here, they were talking about, hey, shouldn't we be looking at people's backgrounds before they can buy a gun? Yes, young leaders, I said to them, you are absolutely right.
Harris consistently points to Congress to pass an assault weapon.
researchers in Michigan used AI to recreate a prehistoric land bridge complete with digital caribou.
One of the researchers I talked to, she described the caribou looked like they were roller skating. Exactly walk.
Plus how the moon transformed our planet and changed life as we know it. All on Science Friday from WNYC Studios.
Tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock on 91.7 WVXU.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Lana Summers.
And I'm Mary Louise Kelly. 7 people trapped on a remote Greek island. One of them will not survive the night. That is the story that unfolds in the new novel, The Fury. The Fury, by the way, is a wild, unpredictable Greek wind, the kind of wind that drives you mad, as the author, Alex Michaelides, hints darkly on the very first page. Alex Michaelides is in our New York bureau. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of the show, so I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we are very happy to have you with us. All right, so just to be clear, we're dealing here with a murder at a house party on a remote island with a storm blowing in, and the killer is one of the house guests. So I have to ask, were you intentionally channeling Agatha Christie? she's clearly lurking in the background here.
Yeah, you know, you can't write a novel like this without, at some level, referencing or being aware of Christie, because she did it first with And Then There Were None. And in my opinion, she did it best. And so many hundreds of writers have tried to do it since then. And so, you know, it felt very important to me in writing this novel that I didn't just rehash Christie's novel. So what I tried to do was just to turn the whole genre on its head. You know, the thing is that reading this kind of novel, because we all have read that kind of setup where people are trapped on an island, you bring all kinds of expectations to it. And so for me, the fun thing would be playing with the reader's expectations.
One thing you do very differently is Hercule Poirot never waltzes in, Miss Marple does not show up. Your characters are left to sort this out amongst themselves. Why did that appeal?
Why did that appeal? I think because that wasn't the kind of story I was trying to write. I felt that I wanted to try and bring this as close as I possibly could to real people, real emotions, and very kind of complex psychologies. And so something about resisting an easy, tidy conclusion with a superhuman detective felt right for me. I wanted it to feel messy and as realistic as I could possibly make it.
What else did you do to turn the Agatha Christie convention on its head?
I think it was a lot about trying to bring a psychology to it. So, you know, I think what really interests me is childhood and childhood trauma. And, you know, I grew up on the very small island of Cyprus. And I was kind of lonely, nervous, anxious child. I still am. And I was obsessed with films and...
Yeah, even up they had great Chicago picture windows, but I remember like maybe
things would come true. There and worked as a screenwriter and realised I was just as miserable and anxious as I had been before. As I started to look inward at my childhood and went on this huge journey of therapy, you know, and I feel that all of these characters that I'm writing about are wounded children, and that's the heart of the novel for me, really, is that kind of aspect of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a theme that runs through it. And you just said you were a lonely, anxious child, and you kind of still are. Your narrator, who we're going to talk more about, but is a man named Elliot, and he feels this so strongly, he sometimes talks out loud to the wounded child inside him. What were you trying to bring out there?
That was my turning point in therapy, I suppose, was this realization that we all carry this traumatized child around with us, and very often we confuse the present and the past, or rather the child in our head does. And it's only by sort of learning to communicate with that child, I think, that we can lead a more authentic and integrated life. And I thought that was a very interesting journey for a hero to go on in a book.
You just called him a hero. Elliot, your narrator, he is one of the house guests. He's not very likable in my view. Why put the story in his hands?
Oh gosh, well, he may not be likable per se, but I think he's quite interesting. And what I tried to do, it was honestly, The Fury was the most creative experience I've had, because I changed the way that I write. For my first 2 novels, The Silent Patient and The Maidens, I plotted them for about a year before writing a word. And then with The Fury, I really wanted to have some fun, and I thought, I'm not going to plot this, I'm just going to write it. And as I wrote it, Elliot told me the story himself, and it was an amazing experience because I wrote it, with him speaking directly to the reader all the way through. And by doing that, I felt that he was sort of telling me the story, I suppose. And all of these things that I didn't know, like about his childhood and his relationship with an older writer named Barbara West, just appeared on the page as I was writing, without me having even the names. Everything just sort of magically happened. So it felt like a really creative, joyous experience for me.
So this is so interesting. Without giving away any plot twists or who the killer is, you're saying you didn't know who the killer was going to be when you started?
No, I didn't. That's why it was so much fun doing writing like that. It was hair-raising, and it led me to all kinds of difficulties, but in terms of a creative experience, it was fantastic.
When you finally figured it out, did you have to go back and unpick all these dead ends and red herrings that you laid out because you didn't know either as you were writing?
Yeah, very easy. It's really funny you say that, because yes, there was a moment when the first draft had a different ending and a different twist, and it didn't work. I showed it to my editors, and they both said, okay, you have a choice now. Either you can bin this book, or you can go back to the beginning and try work something else out. And I think it's a really good lesson in not panicking, because what happened was I put my laptop down for a whole month, and I just walked around the park, and I went through the story beat by beat by beat, and let the characters take me in a different direction. And the one they took me on was much more surprising, much more interesting, and felt much more authentic as well. So.
One more character to ask you about, and I use the term loosely because it's the Fury, it's the weather, this wild creek wind, and I'm interested to hear that you grew up on Cyprus. Is this a wind and a kind of setting that you know firsthand?
Oh yes, I mean, Cyprus is an island of the Mediterranean, and one of the lovely things about Cyprus is its proximity to Greece and the Greek islands. And so I spent a lot of time travelling there when I was younger. The Greek islands are notorious for the wind, and when I was about 20 years old, I was on the island of Mykonos, and I was stranded there for 3 days because the wind was so strong that no boats could leave and no boats could get across the water. And I remember thinking then, oh, that would be a really fun way to trap people for a story. And then, decades later, The Fury emerged. So yes, it's also it's a metaphor for the heightened emotions that kind of run through the book too. It just felt like a very appropriate and happy choice of device, I suppose.
Well, and it's a wind that is powerful enough to blow everything clean. Clues,
yes.
Evidence.
Yes. Yes.
All of it.
Do you know, I didn't think of that, but you're quite right. It solved a lot of problems, actually.
There you go. Alex Michaelides. He's talking about his new novel, The Fury. Thank you so much. This has been great.
That's a real pleasure. Thank you.
To All Things Considered from NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from SmartMouth, committed to the prevention of bad breath for 24 hours. SmartMouth mouthwash, toothpaste, and more can be found nationwide at stores or at smartmouth.com. From the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, for nearly a century, supporting efforts to promote a just, equitable, and sustainable society. More at mott.org. From Progressive Insurance, Progressive is looking for dedicated and forward-thinking individuals to join their growing team. More information, including application, at progressive.com/careers. And from the William T. Grant Foundation, supporting research to improve the lives of young people at wtgrantfdn.org.
Support comes from Joseph Clark Gallery, located in Northside, where African culture celebrates African art. You can immerse yourself in the energy of tribal masks, traditional wooden and bronze figures, tribal currencies, textiles, and jewelry, along with original paintings and artwork from local artists. Learn more at josephclarkgallery.com.
The
says you can't have your cake and eat it too. Sponsoring programming at 91.7 WVXU and 88.5 WMUB not only maximizes your marketing efforts, you also support an important source of award-winning local journalism. The public radio audience is loyal, informed, and involved, and has an inherent appreciation for our sponsors. Information at WVXU.org.
No major traffic problems reported this hour. However, there is a winter weather advisory as we're expected to get 1 to 3 inches of snow.
91.7 WVXU Cincinnati and 88.5 WMUB Oxford. News from Cincinnati Public Radio and NPR.
In my worst dreams, I never thought of such a situation that my son will be sent inside Gaza.
There's a small yet growing anti-war movement in Israel. It includes a group of mothers with sons serving in the military.
It's Thursday, January 18th, and this is All Things Considered from NPR News.
I'm Juana Summers.
And I'm Ari Shapiro. Lawmakers in the state of Maine have crafted some of the most permissive gun laws in the country.
But after last year's mass shooting in Lewiston, advocates for stricter laws say they're gaining support.
This is about finding the right politicians who are willing to do the right thing, more than they're afraid of losing their jobs.
And a look at how some startups are finding new ways to make cement to reduce its carbon footprint.
Most of the emissions from the production of cement do not come from burning fossil fuels.
And we speak with the stars of True Detective Night Country
after these headlines.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Spear. Republican presidential hopeful Nikki Haley is targeting both former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden as she campaigns in New Hampshire ahead of her party's critical primary next week. Senator Sarah McCammon reports she's been hesitant to directly criticize the Republican frontrunner.
When former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley talks about her former boss, Donald Trump, she usually steers clear of directly tackling the criminal charges against him, including attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Former President Trump is hugely popular with the Republican base Haley needs to win over, as she also seeks to appeal to New Hampshire's many independent voters. During a brief campaign stop at a general store in Hooksett, New Hampshire, Haley said she represents a new generation.
Do we want more of the same, or do we want to go forward? It's that simple. More of the same is not just Joe Biden. More of the same is Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Haley is hoping for a strong showing in New Hampshire after a close but disappointing third-place finish in Iowa. Sarah McCammon, NPR News, Manchester.
A New York jury has finished hearing testimony from E. Jean Carroll. She is the writer who has accused former President Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her in the 90s. NPR's Amanda Steele reports she's suing him over defamation after he called her allegations lies.
Carroll is a writer and an advice columnist, and she said she's suing to, quote, get her reputation back. Trump's lawyer, Alina Habba, focused on negative social media comments and messages received by Carroll before Trump reacted to Carroll's claims in June of 2019. Trump, who has attended the last 2 days, was absent today. He previously said he would be in Florida on Thursday for the funeral of his mother-in-law. Jimena Bustillo, NPR News, New York.
In Texas, a second man has pleaded guilty to multiple charges stemming from the 2022 human smuggling attempt that resulted in the deaths of 53 migrants in a sweltering tractor-trailer. It was the nation's deadliest human smuggling incident. Texas Public Radio's Marian Navarro is.
Mexican national Riley Covarrubias Ponce was a member of the organization responsible for the failed attempt to smuggle migrant children and adults from Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico into the United States. Federal prosecutors say Covarrubias Ponce traveled from Houston to accompany the loaded tractor-trailer. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of human smuggling, including conspiracy to transport illegal migrants resulting in death. He faces a maximum penalty of life in prison. Another defendant in the case